Hi, and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Butalia's text, The Other Side of Silence. So we'll skip a little bit now and we'll move on to our next section, the section where the narrator, storyteller Butalia, returns to India after Pakistan, and we had got to know before how she had experienced a very different kind of emotional connect, which in a way deconstructs and transcends any cartographic division. So she connected back to her uncle Ranamama, and then we also mentioned how the travel into a different space, which is Pakistan, was also a little bit of time traveling. She went back in time to reconnect in a pre-partition kinship system, and obviously that generates very complex emotional and memory models. So we're looking at how memory becomes an act of storytelling, so how we can weave memory through an act of storytelling, and that's something which we see in quite recursively in this particular text. Memory as an act of storytelling, memory as a storytelling activity, and memory as a very emotional activity. So this emotionality of memory, the narrative quality of memory, are things which we need to highlight. So this section talks about what happens when she comes back to India and the kind of questions that she is asked after having experienced her relatives in Pakistan, and this should be on your screen. That first time I returned to India from Pakistan, I brought back messages and letters and gifts from the entire family to various members on this side of the border, right? So again, we have we keep talking about how the domestic and the family narratives are sort of interestingly mapped onto the bigger macro political narratives, right? So sometimes the petty family stories, the little family stories, the little stories of difference and quarrel and fighting and litigations, and in terms of who will own the house. So these things become suddenly very, very symbolic in the context of partition. So these two narratives converge at very complex points, and this intersectionality between the familial micro stories and the political macro stories is something which we see happening throughout. So she comes back from Pakistan with a lot of letters and gifts and small things which were sent from the other side of the border. So she quite literally becomes a messenger across the border, per se. So Ranamama had sent a long letter addressed to all his sisters. His only remaining brother was dead by then. Initially, my mother found it difficult to get over a bitterness and resentment and to face the letter I had brought. Her sisters, all 5 of them, who had gathered in a house, sat in a row, curious but also somewhat resentful, right? So again, and this is how we see the ontology and experience of silence become so important, so emotional and so political. They hadn't spoken for so many years. So there is that resentment, and there is that initial ambivalence about opening the letter, whether I should read the letter at all, because they haven't spoken to each other for decades now, right? And that the silence becomes some kind of an identity category. The silence becomes some kind of a emotional and experiential category. It's much more than just wordlessness. It's much more than just emotionlessness. It's much more than informationlessness. It becomes some kind of an experiential category which disconnects even as it connects, right? So that silence becomes interesting over here, and this initial ambivalence or perhaps refusal or resentment about opening the letter is also an extension of that silence. Okay, so her sisters, all 5 of them, who had gathered in a house, sat in a row, curious but also somewhat resentful. Then someone picked up the letter and began reading, and soon it was being passed from hand to hand, with memories being exchanged, tears being shed, and peals of laughter ringing out as stories were recounted and shared. Again, we look at how storytelling becomes a memory activity. Storytelling, which obviously incorporates imagination as well as information. This interesting integration of information and imagination, which constitutes storytelling, that becomes a very interesting instrument for memory, a very interesting signifier of memory, symbolically speaking. And we see that not just symbolically, but also experientially, how storytelling becomes the best form of remembering, the finest form of remembering, as a very and this remembrance is very intimate. It's happening inside a family house, but it's also a shared collective quality. There are people sitting together, sharing the stories, sharing the memories, sharing the letter. So the letter becomes a very symbolic memory capsule it becomes a very symbolic memory instrument, right? And it contains information as well as emotion. And this interesting combination, this weaving of information and imagination, makes this act of remembering very, very cognitive in quality as well as very experiential in quality. And of course, everything is very political. We are looking at the context of partition over here, which was a profoundly political event. So that very complex combination of politics, emotion, effect, symbol, sign, kinship, all come together, and it sort of recounts this wonderful narrative about memory and remembering through silences, right? So silence also becomes almost a communicative category over here, right? It's not just, silence is not just absence, silence is also some kind of a productive presence, right? So not saying something also says a lot, right? And that becomes a communicative category at a certain level. Tell us, the demander, tell us what the house looks like. Is the guava tree still there? So look at the little signifiers, the very domestic, intimate, personal signifiers of identity. Right, so tell us that the house is, the guava tree is still there, and all these stories, all these questions being asked about the different locations around the house. What's happened to the game of Chopper? Who lives in that back now? Hundreds of questions. I tried to answer them all, unsuccessfully. How could I tell them who was in which room or how the house had changed when I hadn't seen the original house myself, right? So again, we have a very interesting combination of a post-memory, an embodiment of post-memory, which is Urvashi Butalia, who is Urvashi Butalia, and people who actually lived there, right? So Butalia, of course, is recreating the entire house from a revisit there, and also from the stories she had heard, but she obviously never lived there. She was born much subsequent to that. She was born in India after partition. Right, so, and these are people who are aunts, are people who lived and grew up in the house. So it's a very interesting dialogue between the memory generation and the post-memory generation happening here. Ranat's letter was read and reread, touched, smelled, laughed, and wept over. Suddenly my mother and my aunts had acquired a family across the border. So this letter becomes almost a semiotic connect. It's a system of signs, the letter, right? It's also a communicative capsule. It communicates certain information and emotion through certain signs and symbols, which is a letter. So that letter, that communicative symbol becomes the connect across the borders over here. Right, so suddenly the kinship is reestablished, suddenly the kinship is regenerated through the signs, through the semiotic structure. We kept in touch after that. Occasional letters did manage to arrive. I went back to Lahore several times and met him again. Once he wrote to my mother, I wish I could lock up Urvashi in a cage and keep her here. And she told me that I made a real difference in his life, as he had, I think, to mine. For he had set me on a path from which it has been difficult to withdraw. Right? So this becomes an experiential journey for Urvashi Butalia. This becomes a research journey for her. This becomes an ethnographic story. This becomes a personal story. And this is where her research and emotional involvement with the partition begins to sort of start. The inception point, so to speak. But all resentments die hard, and there are many things that lie beneath the surface which we cannot even apprehend. Once, when I was going to visit him, my mother said to me, ask him if he buried or cremated my mother. I looked at her in shock. Religion has never meant much to her. She isn't an atheist, but she has little patience with the trappings of religion. So, we can see how religion becomes a marker of identity, a marker of existential identity, a marker of familial identity, right? So depending on whether her mother got buried or cremated, she'll get to know whether her mother's original identity was preserved or was it subverted by the conversion of Rana, which was, as we know, a convenient conversion after partition. He became Muslim. Why does it matter to you? I said to her, just ask him. She said, implaceable. I asked him, how could she have stayed on here and kept her original name? I had to make her a convert. She was called Aisha Bibi. He said, I buried her, right? And, we can see how this renaming also becomes, in a certain sense, a regeneration of identity, which is an ad hoc production after partition. So after partition, these identities have to be produced suddenly for the matter of convenience, for the matter of security and safety. And we are told that the grandmother was renamed Aisha Bibi, and of course she had to be, buried, in a Muslim ritual. So she wasn't cremated according to the Hindu ritual. She was buried. And again, this ritual becomes a marker of identity, a marker of post-partition identity. And that's something which bothers, that's something which makes a difference, not just at a religious level, but also at a very personal, existential level. So it's almost as if a large part of her identity was reformed or taken away or deformed, and she became someone else with the arrival of a new name. And of course, that continued posthumously, with her burial. So I often wonder what kind of silent twilight my grandmother lived in for all these 9 years of the partition. So, the choice of the time, twilight, is interesting in a way, because in a twilight is obviously the liminal time between sunset and evening, that shading period where things begin to become dark, where one particular order of time ends and the other is about to begin, that transition period. So it's quite appropriate as a metaphor to talk about partition. And this is the twilight period in which her grandmother lived, and she often wondered how she lived around that time. Did she not wonder where her children had gone? Did she think that hell abandoned her? Did she even understand what had happened? Dayawanti, the merciful one, had indeed been fortunately named. Blessed with a large family, her surviving children numbered 9, 6 daughters and 3 sons, and a husband whose medical practice was enormously successful. She had good reason to be happy. Then suddenly, tragedy struck and her husband took ill and died. As a mother tells her, Dayawanti retreated into some kind of shell from then on, although cooking and caring for the children would occasionally pull her out of this. Then a second tragedy happened. The eldest son, Vikram, died in an air crash on a practice flight, and Dayawanti again sought solace in an inner world. When partition came, the chances are that Dayawanti did not know what was happening, but that journey in and out of the twilight world must have left her with long moments for one might call sanity. What must she have wondered about her family? Who could she have asked? What must she have felt about her new identity? Well, my mother has often described her mother as a Qatar Hindu, not a rabid, flame-spouting type, but a strong believer who derived comfort from her daily routine of prayer and fasting. What must it have cost her to convert overnight into a different faith, a different routine? Did it, I wonder, bring on an even more intense alienation, a further recoil into herself? Or did it bring on the reverse, a kind of cold, clear sanity and understanding of the lie that she had to live till she died? Who was with her in those 9 years? Will history be answerable for Dayawanti's life and death? Now, the reason why I read out the whole section is because this particular figure is a spectral presence in this context. I mean, she died 9 years after partition. She never really inhabits the text except as a character. We don't get to hear her speak. We don't see her side of the story. We just told things about her. And again, we can see how the very personal, emotional sense of loss and emotional experiences of loss that she suffered to different degrees. The death of her husband, death of her first son, and of course the partition. So that sequentially makes her a different kind of person. And of course, with partition, it doesn't make a difference to her because chances are she did not know what was happening. And then we are also told that certainly, after the partition, she had to be converted into Islam and she became someone else. And one can only speculate what that must have caused to her mentally. Did it make her even more recoil and withdrawn, or did it just make her more, just bring out the sanity, understanding that she was living a lie, that everything that she had lived for were just rituals and constructs, and anything that is a construct can be deconstructed and reconstructed, right? So the partition, in a certain sense, it brought into the surface the constructed quality about identities, the constructed qualities about emotional affiliations, right? And this emotional landscape and the political landscape became completely incompatible with each other. And she stayed back, but one can only speculate what she must have felt like. Was she alienated, or did she get a clearer understanding of life at an existential level? Did she become more sane? Did she become more clear? Did she become more direct in terms of the fact that all her life has been a lie, that all her little rituals have been just meaningless, right? And the religious thing comes at the end as well, where we get to know from Butalia's mother that his grandmother character was a very spiritual Hindu. She was someone who, a very strong believer and someone who drew a lot of sustenance from her prayers and offerings. And for that person to change into a different religion overnight. What that must have done to her existentially is a question that we can only speculate. But there are two possibilities that Butalia is offering. One, it could have made him more retreated, it could have made him more withdrawn, and secondly, it could have given a clearer understanding of the meaninglessness of rituals, the meaninglessness of the constructed identities that she had inhabited and suffered throughout her life. And the final sentence becomes interesting. Will history be answerable for their want its life and death? Now, history obviously is a discursive quality, a discursive narrative away, something which is discursively determined, politically informed, ideologically informed. There are different kinds of factors involving history. But then that artificiality of history, the artificiality of the movement of history, can that be held accountable for the tragedy and the sufferings in the other nations that they want to suffer at an emotional level? So we have, again, a bit of a disjuncture in history as a meta-narrative, as a material narrative, as an artificial narrative, as a grand narrative, and the human memory is something which happens inside it in a negotiation with history. But then sometimes it can be out of sync with history as well, right? It's sometimes compatible, sometimes incompatible, and that's a purely random moment, a purely random situation, whether they're compatible or incompatible, right? So that quality in history and memory is something that becomes very, very interesting, and it's a very burning question. But this section about the twilight category of the character becomes interesting. First of all, she is a spectral presence, she's a hauntological presence, a haunted ontology, someone who's just there, but then she's also some kind of a metaphor of partition. She also becomes a symbol of sorts of partition, and this very interesting movement between matter, metaphor, and memory becomes very interesting in terms of understanding what the partition must have been to all these people who sort of lived through it, people who had suffered emotionally and existentially before. Did partition mean a lot to them, or was it just another blow that they had to negotiate with? And again, this whole ad hoc conversion to some kind of other identity also becomes interesting, and that also reveals the constructed quality of identity in the first place, while also perhaps giving another very, very big tragic blow to her sense of sustenance, to her sense of existential core, to her sense of existential rootedness that may have been completely uprooted. We don't quite know, but these are the possibilities that Butalia is speculating over here. So let's stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this and begin to wind up this section in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.